That's back and forth, but it's all directed to God. And when we direct our worship to God, we receive strength from it because we meditate on who God is and what He has done for us. And David says, when I go in to worship God, He conceals me from my fear. That's the references to the tabernacle, to the tent, and to the rock. David says, when I go to worship God, I forget my fears. And I'm reminded of His power. I'm reminded of His wisdom. I'm reminded of His love. And so David says, here is my confidence. Because as I stand on this rock, look what he says in verse 6. Now my head will be lifted up above my enemies around me. David says, I'm not afraid of my enemies. Why? Because I look down on my enemies. How? Because I see them from God's perspective. You see, David's not looking at his enemies from his perspective. If he did, he'd be looking up at his enemies. But he's looking at his enemies from God's perspective, and that's how he can look down on them. I am bigger than what I fear. I am better than what I fear. I am stronger than what I fear. Why? Because Christ lives in me. And so he says, verse 6, second part of the verse, I will offer in His tent sacrifices with shouts of joy, even I will sing, yes, I will sing praises to the Lord. And thank God we've got a number of David's songs that he wrote here in our Bible, the book of Psalms. David says, I'm going to sing to God. When I'm afraid, I'm going to sing. Is that what you do when you're afraid? You sing when you're afraid? David says, when I'm afraid, I go worship God. I sing. Sing about God. I sing about what He has done for me and who He is, how He loves me, how He takes care of me, and how He has shepherded me. David has a confidence that is born out of his obedience to God. There's another story about David that we're not quite as familiar with. It's found in 2 Samuel chapter 20. 2 Samuel chapter 20, David has a man in his kingdom. He's king now. He's got a man in his kingdom by the name of Sheba. And Sheba is wanting to rebel against David. He's raised up an insurrection against David. And David's military, his army, led by his commander Joab, has started chasing Sheba. And Sheba runs to this town called Abel-Beth-Maachah. And Abel-Beth-Maachah is a city that is large enough to where it's surrounded by a huge wall. And Joab and his armies gets their battering rams and they start beating down this door. They're after Sheba because he's raised this insurrection against David. And this woman, a woman, we don't know her name. The Bible says twice in this short account, calls her a wise woman. This woman looks down over the wall of this town and she calls out to Joab and she says, what are you doing here? What can we do for you? And Joab yells up at her, I am looking for Sheba because he's raised an insurrection against our King David. And this woman who is wise, she says, you wait right here. And she goes and she talks to the people of the town and she tells them what's going on and she convinces them that they need to deliver Sheba to Joab. And so they take Sheba, they find him, and they cut his head off. And they throw his head over the wall. And Joab takes his arm and he leaves the city. Why did I share that story with you? Because as far as the text is concerned, David knew nothing about it. As far as the text is concerned, we don't know who this woman is. Now, presuming that she's in heaven one day, then we might imagine her walking up to King David and saying, look, I'm the one who at Abel-Beth-Maachah encouraged the town folk to deliver Sheba into the hands of your commander Joab. I'm the one who saved your life, and you never knew. That was God working in David's life. You see, that's why David didn't have to fear. That's why David is able to say, I've got confidence. Why? Because he knew God was working on his behalf. And so David's got confidence because he says, I'm standing on a rock in my God. Now, David goes back here in verses 7 through 10. He says, let me tell you why I've got this confidence. I hid it in worship to God. Look what he says, verse 7. And in fact, when we read verses 7 through 10, notice how many times David addresses a command to God. A command to God. We can't command God to do anything, of course. It's called a divine imperative, where you recognize I don't have the right to tell God to do anything, but I'm certainly begging Him to. I'm asking Him to. Look what he said at the beginning of verse 7. Hear, O Lord, when I cry with my voice, and be gracious to me and answer me. When you fear, tell God about it. It doesn't matter what you fear. It doesn't matter how petty it is to some people at least. Tell God about it. Talk to God. Pray about it. David says, God, hear me. Verse 8, when you said, seek my face, my heart said to you, your face, O Lord, I will seek. I want to know you, God. Do not hide your face from me. Do not turn your servant away in anger. You have been my help. David reminds himself of these things that God has done for him through his life. Do not abandon me nor forsake me, O God of my salvation. Notice verse 10. Verse 10 is one of Rachel's favorite verses in the book of Psalms. For my father and my mother have forsaken me, but the Lord will take me up. We may not have a family here on earth that is concerned about us spiritually. We've got a God in heaven who is. We've got a Father in heaven who's concerned. And David is able to have this confidence in God because of his view of God and how He answers prayers. And brethren and friends, God has not changed. God doesn't deal with us in the same way, under the same law as He did with David under the law of Moses, but He's still the same God. And He still loves us with the same intense love that He had for David. And we can pray the same prayer to God today. God, you told me to seek your face, and I'm seeking your face. Don't turn your ear away from me. Hear me. And so David is able to have this confidence in God because he worships God. He's mentioned singing, and now he's talking about prayer. Two of the acts of worship that we engage in today. David is able to have that confidence in God. And because David has had that confidence in God, and I mentioned at the first part of the lesson, 2 Corinthians 1, 3, and 4, we are encouraged by God when we are down so that we can in turn encourage others. David receives strength from God because of what God has done for him. And David turns in verses 11 through 14 to strengthen me and you. That's at least part of the reason why he wrote Psalms 27 and why God preserved Psalms 27 for me and you to have in our Bibles, so that we can be encouraged by his experiences with God. Notice what he says, verses 11 through 14. Teach me your way, O Lord, and lead me in a level path because of my foes. First of all, David says, let me obey you, God. Now see, if we're not a Christian, if we're not faithful to God, then we have every reason to be afraid of death. That's why David says, teach me, God. Let me know your way. Lead me in a level path so that I can obey you. The kind of courage that David has flows out of his obedience to God. Jesus says, he that believes and is baptized shall be saved. I believe that. And if I believe God and I'm baptized for the forgiveness of my sins, then I've got that promise. It is in my hand as if it is something that is tangible and I can hold. That is the power of God's promise. And David here says, teach me your way and lead me in your path so that I can obey you. So, there is one type of courage that is illustrated with, let's say, a fellow in the army who is overly zealous and goes storming blindly into the enemy camp. You know, that's not the kind the courage that we see in someone in the army perhaps who has been in fights like that. And they know how to approach the enemy. And they are courageous, yes, but they use more of their wisdom and their wit than blind rage, perhaps. It is courage born out of experience. And that's what we see in David. David knows how God reacts. David knows how dependable God is. And so he says in verse 12, "Do not deliver me over to the desires of my adversaries, for false witnesses have risen against me, and such as breathe out violence. I would have despaired unless I had believed that I would see the goodness of the Lord." He mentions the beauty of the Lord back in verse 4. And now he talks about the goodness of the Lord here. Let me remind you of another story from the life of King David. This one comes from the end of 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel, where he is in the village of Keilah, 1 Samuel chapter 23. And that's when King Saul is chasing him. David's been anointed king, but he's not become king yet. Saul is still king. And David is running from him, and David comes to the village of Keilah. And David prays to God, and he says, "God, King Saul is after me. Are these people, Keilah, going to deliver me into the hands of King Saul to save your own life?" And God says, "Yes, David, these people are going to turn you over. They're going to betray you." That is, if you stay here. And so David gets up and runs. And the Bible says clearly in 1 Samuel chapter 23 and verse 14, God did not deliver David into the hands of King Saul. You see what's going on there? David prays to God. He says, "God, I've got a fork in the road in my life. Which path do I take?" No. God says, "David, if you stay on this path, you're going to be delivered in the hands of King Saul." God saves his life. And so David takes this path. David obeys God because he listens to God and knows God knows what's best. And you and I will be better off if we listen to God. And so in verse 14, David says, "Here is what I want to do." He says in verse 13, "I would have despaired unless I had believed that I would see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living." And now look what he says in verse 14. He turns his attention to those of us who are listening to what he says. Verse 14 is really for me. He says, "Wait for the Lord. Be strong and let your heart take courage." Yes, wait for the Lord. He's not talking to God when he says those words. He's talking to me. He's saying, here's what I've experienced in my life, and here's what I want you to do. I want you to wait for the Lord. I want you to take courage and be strong. Wait for the Lord. Faith and patience go hand in hand. David turns his attention now to me and you and says, "I want you to have courage too." We are so thankful to hear the good news that Brother Cecil got from his doctor this week. And we pray for others who are having those types of treatments that they will go well also. And Brother Cecil, one Sunday, when his voice is ready and his voice is strong, he's going to give us words of encouragement. How Christ has strengthened him and helped him get through what he's experienced. He's going to do exactly what David is doing here in verse 14. He's going to encourage us through the courage that he has received from God working in his life. And we look forward to it. So we all fear something. But David here was saying, walk with God. Walk with Jesus Christ. Look to the cross and realize that Jesus died on the cross so that you and I would not have to fear death. Can we have a faith continue on? We can.